The late 1840s saw a revival of revolutionary activism in Europe. This new political agitation corresponded with the general economic downturn across the continent during the period. A series of poor harvests significantly hit rural society during the decade, and with it, impacted the lives of the European peasantry. In 1845, the Irish potato blight had an adverse effect on European agriculture, followed by successive crop failures across the continent over the next 2 years. As a result, food became scarcer and prices rose, generating mass discontent in the countryside. Food shortages were so severe that the decade popularly became known as the Hungry Forties, and this crisis put strains on governments now faced with combating rural economic hardship and agricultural decline. Making matters worse, a general economic downturn simultaneously occurred. The industrial boom of the 1830s and early 1840s had seen growth for manufacturers and financiers who poured money into new business ventures, railroad building, and other projects. Many of these ventures, however, had been financed on credit, and as the economy began to contract after 1845, banks began calling in these loans. Speculators found that they could not pay, resulting in bankruptcies and a lull in manufacturing. Business owners were faced with the choice of either cutting jobs or going out of business. The result was widespread unemployment. Out-of-work laborers and the growing appeal of socialism only added to this toxic mix, creating new conditions for the spread of radical ideas and political unrest. And this was becoming increasingly evident in France as the 1840s continued. From its inception, the July monarchy had been unable to address the many problems plaguing French society. A growing Republican opposition mixed with labor unrest revealed the precarious situation confronted by the regime as street protests erupted throughout the decade. Radicals in the streets of Paris were not the only threat. Abroad, the French military was engaged in a protracted conflict against Algerian insurgents as it attempted to pacify France's new North African colony. However, overall, the economic prosperity generated during the 1830s proved enough to sustain support for the government at home. The bourgeoisie made profits while workers had jobs, discouraging any form of mass protest. Yet during the mid-1840s, this situation changed. An economic downturn brought an end to the boom years of growth and prosperity. Those hit hardest by the Depression were workers and small business owners. These groups could not defend their interest in politics due to the voting qualifications. The only means at their disposal were therefore street demonstrations, and this form of activism was met with resistance from the police and military. Soon enough, small rebellions were being waged in major French cities, where barricades were thrown up in working-class neighborhoods and workers and radicals took to the streets. This situation became ever more dire after 1846. That year, the French wheat harvest failed, producing a severe food shortage throughout the country. In addition to economic and social grievances, hunger was now added to the list. Broad calls for economic reform became the battle cry of hungry workers and reformers who demanded a voice in government. Yet to these calls, Guizot only gave his characteristic reply of "get rich." It was a telling indication that the disenfranchised could expect nothing from the government. To circumvent the censorship laws in place, Republicans, drawing support from small business owners and laborers, began staging banquets. Under this banquet campaign, people would be invited to attend a large dinner, which was ostensibly apolitical in nature. In reality, however, these gatherings quickly turned political, with criticism of the government vocalized and discussed. In this way, Republican opponents sought to avoid state censorship policies and rally supporters. The government was not deceived by this strategy and knew what Republicans were actually doing at these banquets. Therefore, when authorities got news of a large banquet scheduled in Paris on February 22, 1848, the government decided to make an example of it. When guests arrived at the banquet hall, they found the doors to the room blocked by the police. With their access to the hall barred, the arriving Republicans decided to take their message to the streets. By the following day, crowds were gathering outside the Ministry of Justice, brandishing signs, criticizing the government, and calling for Guizot's resignation. Faced with a large protest right in the center of the capital, soldiers were called in to ensure that order was maintained. In one encounter, soldiers came face to face with protesters, and in this tense moment, soldiers accidentally fired on the crowd, killing 52 people. With blood now spilled, radicals began organizing an effective response. By the next day, Paris was once again embroiled in a revolutionary uprising. Faced with unrest in the streets, Louis Philippe immediately abdicated his throne, putting an end to the July monarchy. In its place, a new republic was declared, the Second Republic. Workers were adamant to have their grievances addressed and demanded a socialist government that would resolve their hardships and give them a voice in government. Conservatives and moderates had no intention of tolerating a socialist regime. As Alexis de Tocqueville proclaimed, "The Republic of February must be democratic, but it must not be socialist." At the moment, however, there was little choice in this matter, lest another revolution ensue. Social tensions had provoked the revolutionary uprising of 1848 in Paris, and the workers were going to have to be appeased. Conservatives could only wait and bide their time. In the meantime, the Republican socialist Louis Blanc set up a provisional government that intended to solve the problems caused by unemployment and industrialization. Every worker, he believed, had a right to work, and the state was obliged to secure this right. To this end, he authorized the creation of state-sponsored workshops. These workshops were charged with creating jobs for the unemployed, realizing Blanc's right-to-work policy in France. Henceforth, laborers unable to secure work would be employed by the state. At the same time, universal manhood suffrage was declared, ensuring that workers would have a voice in politics. In line with the expectations of the left, the February uprising would be a social revolution, one that would bring forth a social republic. Within weeks of the news coming from Paris, demonstrations and protests broke out in almost all the major European capitals. Years of economic downturn and conservative government policies had bred a variety of social frustrations that now came out in a torrent across the continent. In March, demonstrations in Vienna provoked the dismissal of the hated Austrian Chancellor Clemens von Metternich. The chief architect of the Congress of Vienna and a veritable symbol of conservatism across Europe, Metternich had been a particular target of Austrian liberals tired of the Habsburg absolutist system. Taking heart from the events occurring in Paris, liberals did not hesitate to demand Metternich's dismissal and call for meaningful political reform. Faced with crowds mobilizing in the street, the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand felt it wise to heed these demands. Metternich's fall from power was met with celebrations and further protests across Europe, as it suddenly appeared the old order across the continent was about to fall apart. Intellectuals and demonstrators hailed the moment as a springtime of nations, a moment signaling the victory of liberal and nationalist aspirations over absolutism and royal tyranny. In almost every country, from France to Romania, crowds assembled. Censorship was lifted, and radical newspapers began to promote democratic ideas, print petitions, and call for the writing of new constitutions. Writers gave a voice to the people by turning out patriotic poems and proclaiming the birth of new democratic nation-states. Many went as far as to insist that 1848 marked a new era in history. All Europe's social problems would be solved, absolutism would be swept away, and the people would take control of their own destinies. As the French poet Charles Baudelaire cynically put it, in 1848, everyone built utopias, just like castles in Spain. Prussia was one of the leading states in the German Confederation. It was also one of the most absolutists, built upon a strong tradition of Prussian militarism and authoritarianism shaped by the Hohenzollern dynasty, which had ruled since the days of Friedrich the Great. In early 1848, the reigning Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm, summoned the representative body, or Diet, in Berlin to request money needed for rail construction in the country. Friedrich Wilhelm assumed this would be a routine procedure, since in the past, the Prussian kings had requested funds with little opposition. However, desires for liberal reform had been building in Prussia over the years, and this entailed that things did not go according to plan as the Diet assembled. No sooner had the king requested the needed funds than liberals sitting in the Diet began demanding a constitution and greater parliamentary powers. After listening to these grievances, Friedrich Wilhelm professed that the crown was united with the Prussian people in their concerns, adding that he hoped a scrap of paper need not come between a ruler and his people to demonstrate this unity. His reference to a constitution as a mere scrap of paper enraged Prussian liberals. In response, members of the Diet insisted that until the king granted a constitution, they would not authorize the funds requested. And so, a stalemate ensued. While novel, these arguments were taking shape just as Louis Philippe's government in France was overthrown. Friedrich Wilhelm was foresighted enough to see the possible dangers in this situation, and so, in typical absolutist fashion, he decided to simply dissolve the Diet and silence the opposition outright. Blocked from expressing their views in the Diet, liberals joined with radical students and workers to put pressure on the government. In the coming days, demonstrations were staged in the streets of Berlin. In some instances, protests turned violent and barricades were thrown up throughout the streets of the capital. Berlin was now succumbing to the revolutionary ambiance of 1848. Facing a potential mass insurrection, Friedrich Wilhelm felt it best to appease the liberals and quell the protest movements before they spiraled out of control. In May, a united diet was called to draw up a national constitution for the kingdom. Members were elected to this diet through universal suffrage, with every male over the age of 18 allowed to participate in selecting delegates. When all the votes were cast, the liberals were horrified to find that representatives of the working classes had won a significant number of seats and would now be able to influence the drafting of the new constitution. During the first days of the Berlin Revolution, worker organizations had formed to ensure that the interests of labor were represented. Some of these organizations were moderate and sought policies that would combat unemployment, poverty, and the deplorable conditions found in factories. However, other worker organizations held a more radical position. Inspired by Marxist and Republican ideas, they called for the complete overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a democratic republic that would guarantee the freedom and equality of all Prussian citizens. These demands were far too radical for liberals, and it was quickly evident that a split was beginning to emerge in the revolutionary movement. On one side were the liberals, calling for constitutional reform and greater representation. On the other were the workers and radicals, calling for the overthrow of the state and social equality. Fearing that the situation was on the verge of anarchy, Friedrich Wilhelm decided enough was enough. On his orders, troops stormed the Diet meeting hall and closed down the Constitutional Assembly. Work on the new constitution was immediately halted, and Berlin was placed under martial law. All revolutionary organizations and societies were broken up by the police. The revolution came to a sudden halt. Liberals stood by as this occurred. They neither protested nor took up arms against the restoration of the absolutist system. Royal rule, they reasoned, was preferable to a radical worker uprising. Liberals had persistently harbored a mistrust of radical and worker groups, and this mistrust effectively doomed the Prussian Revolution to failure. As events in Prussia revealed, revolutionary aspirations could be conflicting and even divisive. This was equally evident in the events that played out in the Habsburg Empire to the south. In Austria, the initial protests and demonstrations that spring had met with success. Liberal agitation had driven Metternich from power and forced Emperor Ferdinand to agree to a constitution. Like other European powers, the Habsburg state was an absolutist regime averse to liberal reform. Yet, unlike other powers, it was also a multi-ethnic empire, making it distinct from other European kingdoms. In fact, the Habsburg emperor held 3 crowns: one of Austria, one of Bohemia, and one of Hungary. In addition to these kingdoms, the family ruled over various other duchies and principalities in Central Europe and Northern Italy. While the Habsburgs were a German royal dynasty, many of their subjects were not ethnically German. The empire was a mosaic of Germans, Hungarians, Italians, Romanians, Czechs and Slavs, Jews and Muslims. Given the character and makeup of the empire, the very idea of national self-determination was a nightmare for the dynasty. In the views of many Habsburg administrators, Nationalism would spell the complete dismemberment of this multi-ethnic empire. Unsurprisingly, the Habsburgs had been cold to liberal reform and the French Revolution. However, in March of 1848, Emperor Ferdinand faced rising demands he could not simply sweep under the rug. Complicating this picture was the fact that protest was not just coming from Vienna or even Austria. No sooner had demonstrations broken out in Vienna than the other national groups of the empire began to do the same. As momentum mounted, Czech and Hungarian nationalists began demanding their own parliaments and greater freedom from Viennese oversight. Inspired by these movements, the Slavic population of the empire also put forward its own demands against Habsburg authority. That June, they called a Slav Congress, demanding political and cultural autonomy for the Slavic nationalities of the empire. These various challenges threatened to dilute the power of Vienna over the imperial territories. If unaddressed, they might even destroy the empire completely. As 1848 unfolded, Ferdinand found himself facing a potentially dire situation. And of these nationalist movements, Hungary was by far the most troublesome. The Hungarians had a long tradition of independence dating back to the Middle Ages. While they had accepted Habsburg rule in the 16th century, Hungarians had preserved their own unique identity. They were not Germans, they were Magyars, an ethnic group with its own language and culture distinct from the Germans of the empire. This sense of ethnic particularism lent itself to a brand of nationalism that had been growing up over the 19th century. By the 1840s, the journalist and lawyer Lajos Kossuth was the chief spokesman for this movement. In March, Kossuth led the charge for calls of Hungarian autonomy. A new government was set up in Budapest, which did not have to consult with Vienna in matters of internal Hungarian politics. Feudalism was abolished throughout the entire kingdom, liberating the Hungarian peasantry. A separate Hungarian army and national budget was created, along with the calling of an autonomous Hungarian parliament to be elected by all property holders. All of these measures assured a Hungarian government run from Budapest by ethnic Magyars, not one governed from Vienna by Germans. Yet if Kossuth's Magyar autonomy movement appeared successful that spring, the Hungarian Revolution would take its own unique turn. While a Hungarian national kingdom had been declared, questions over what Hungarian nationality was and who would rule were hardly clear. Hungary had a variety of ethnic groups within its borders. While the Magyars were dominant in the northwest, they were in fact a minority in the kingdom. Other areas were populated by ethnic Romanians, Croats, Jews, and Slavs. No sooner had Kossuth brokered a deal for Hungarian autonomy than these other ethnicities began making similar demands on the revolutionary Hungarian government, posing a threat to Magyar control in the kingdom. That spring, Serbs inhabiting the eastern region of Vojvodina presented a petition to the new Hungarian government. In this petition, Serb leaders stated they would support the new government in return for official recognition of the Orthodox Church and the use of Serbian as an official state language. Kossuth, under no illusions, knew that to concede to such demands would inspire other minorities to make similar claims, and so he flatly rejected the Serb petition, stating, "Only the sword will decide this matter." To enforce this ruling, Kossuth began rounding up suspected revolutionaries and nationalists in the Vojvodina, and handed out death sentences to Serbian nationalist leaders who refused to comply. A series of bloody reprisals launched by Serbian militants followed. In response, the Hungarian army began a systematic suppression of all Serb groups, inciting a fierce ethnic conflict that plunged the eastern half of the kingdom into war. By June of 1848, Romanians within the Hungarian territories of Transylvania and the Banat similarly rose up in a revolt against Magyar rule, calling for union in a new and independent Romanian nation. Much as in dealing with the Serb question, the Hungarian military opted for suppression, sparking a new round of ethnic warfare that further destabilized the kingdom. These minority revolts were a blessing for Vienna, which provided military and logistical support for these rebellions in an effort to inflame internal conflicts and weaken the revolutionary government in Budapest. The tactic worked. By the summer of 1848, the Hungarian Revolution had dissolved into a series of bloody civil wars divided along ethnic lines. The Hungarian state won by Kossuth that spring was destroyed, and by 1849, Hungary was once again placed under German rule. As the Hungarian Revolution demonstrated, nationalism proved to be a double-edged sword. If it proved liberating for some, it could also breed sharp conflicts and lead to the oppression of others. These tensions effectively splintered the Hungarian Revolution, jeopardizing the hopes of Hungarian autonomists who had set out to challenge rule from the imperial center. In France, where the revolutionary agitation had first begun, the government also found itself racked by internal disagreements and tensions as 1848 progressed. Taking charge that spring, the socialist Louis Blanc had endeavored to create a social republic responsive to the demands of labor. To this end, he had assisted with the creation of national workshops that provided jobs and aid to the unemployed. Yet these workshops quickly began to arouse a reaction. The rural peasantry cared little for the hardships of urban workers. For them, these workshops meant one thing: higher taxes. Liberals and conservatives were likewise cool to Blanc's program. They had little taste for socialism. This atmosphere did not bode well for Blanc and his vision of a social republic. When a new round of elections was held that summer, Blanc's government was swept out of office. Conservatives used this turn as an opportunity to implement a new strategy. They began dismantling the workshops and scaling back the socialist policies Blanc had enacted. When these changes were announced, workers took to the streets. They had believed that the revolution of 1848 would be a victory for the working classes. Now, they had been betrayed. On June 22nd, barricades were thrown up throughout the capital as radicals and workers fought to defend their dream of a social republic. The so-called Red Days of June were the most traumatic social conflict France had yet experienced. Worker resistance compelled the government to call in the military and suppress the uprising. Unsurprisingly, most of these generals had made names for themselves fighting in Algeria, often using brutal tactics against native insurgents. These same tactics were now used mercilessly on the Parisian working classes. Over the following days, a tenuous order was restored, leaving the streets of the capital littered with bodies and soaked in blood. In the aftermath of the June days, the government had little patience for worker demands. Socialism posed an imminent threat and needed to be purged from the country. Worker organizations were suppressed. Working-class newspapers were rigorously censored and shut down. Political radicals and the unemployed who posed a threat to social order were deported to Algeria. Over the next 3 years, nearly 12,000 workers were shipped across the Mediterranean, some voluntarily and others by force. This aggressive form of state-sponsored colonization marked an attempt to put an end once and for all to the social question in France. With the Socialists defeated and order restored, the last piece of the puzzle was the presidential election scheduled for December 1848. A strong conservative candidate was needed, but one who could appeal to a wide array of voters. It was especially important to appeal to the newly enfranchised peasants, who were now the vast majority of the electorate in France. That autumn, a promising candidate came forward, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the famous general. A newcomer to French politics, it was believed that Louis Napoleon would cater to conservative and middle-class elites in return for being elected head of state. The name Bonaparte was popular among the peasantry, who fondly remembered his uncle as the man who had given them land. In essence, Louis Napoleon seemed the perfect candidate, a conservative who could pose as a popular and progressive leader, a politician capable of rallying liberals while catering to the interests of elite and the business classes. In his run for president, Louis campaigned as a man of order who could restore authority and prosperity to France. His message was clear and convincing. When all the votes were counted, Louis Napoleon was elected President of the Republic by a significant majority. 33 years after Waterloo, a Bonaparte was once again head of state in France. Many people had greeted the revolutionary movements of 1848 with enthusiasm. They had believed that they would usher in a new age of national and democratic freedom for the continent. Europe would have its own people's revolution, and with it, bring an end to absolutism and tyranny. Yet as events took their course, these hopes were dashed. It was with a sense of profound sorrow, wrote the Russian political exile Alexander Herzen, that he watched the movements of 1848 crumble before his eyes. In the spring of 1848, as people gathered and regimes faltered, expectations had run high that a new period of transformation akin to the years of the French Revolution was on the horizon. The entire continent, it seemed, stood on the verge of a new age of liberalism and national emancipation led by the people. Yet these hopes had proven fleeting. Mistrust between liberals and workers, divergent interests between revolutionaries and peasants, and fierce ethno-national conflicts had all taken their toll as the revolutions disintegrated. By the winter of 1849, most of the absolutist regimes had been restored to power, and Republican France was on its way to becoming a new authoritarian Bonapartist regime. In the wake of this experience, an entire generation expressed grave doubts about the potential of their ideals and the values they held. In the spring of 1848, anything had seemed possible. A year later, however, everything appeared doubtful and tainted. 4 months ago, the situation was unspoiled, wrote the French author Victor Hugo in the aftermath of the June days. Who will ever recover that virginity? No one. Everything has been ruined and compromised. The mind wanders from the difficult to the impossible. There would be much time for reflection afterwards, much brooding and blame to throw about. Yet the fact remained. The failures of 1848 marked a painful defeat for an entire generation raised in the wake of the French Revolution. A generation which had envisioned a new world of equality, liberty, and national harmony within its grasp.